Chapter 3. I had found out about it during an adventure worth mentioning. A few weeks earlier, you see, my brother Sherlock had very nearly caught me, but in the crucial few minutes while he was summoning the constabulary to scour the streets for me, I found an unlikely refuge. 221B Baker Street. That is to say, Sherlock's own lodgings, which I had entered by means of a plane tree, a rooftop, and a bedchamber window. Ever since, I had wondered how my brother had reacted when, returning to his rooms at dawn, he had discovered my burnt, cast-off nun's habit in his grate, and a few items missing from his wardrobe. I imagined he had felt utterly chagrined. Oddly, this thought did not make me smile. Now, if it had been Mycroft, some other time perhaps, as I was saying, hiding for several hours in Sherlock's lodgings, while he hunted me throughout every lane and alley, mews and court in the area, I had put the time to good use by examining my brother's possessions. That man had an entire cabinet full of wigs and false beards and so on, but also accoutrements of disguise utterly new to me. Face putty, stick-on warts and scars, dreadful, like ruined medieval battlements steeped in creosote, false teeth to cover his own well-kept ones, skull caps to make him look bald or partly so, skin pigments varying from ruddy to swarthy, various false fingernails, unkempt or yellow or ridged or overlong as if in mourning, a glue-on device to change the shape of his mouth, and gave him the look of a hare lip. Altogether my eyes were opened wide. Where had my brother acquired such uncommonly useful items? Searching his desk, then, I had found receipts from various shops, most of them in the theatre district, and frankly intended to serve the needs of the stage. I hardly thought I would pass as an actress, but a few items several years ago had come from a shop in Holywell Street, a shop called Chanticleer's. So I thought I would try there first. My brother had not purchased anything at Chanticleer's in some time. Perhaps the place had closed. But there was only one way to find out, and if the shop remained, excellent. My brother had taken his business elsewhere, for whatever reasons, and I would be unlikely to encounter him. Chanticleer's, hence the sign carved in the shape of a rooster. Chanticleer meant a rooster, just as Reynard meant a fox. Where the latter had come from I had no idea, but the former I had read in one of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Struggling across the teeming street, Holywell always thronged with all manner of Londoners ogling the pictures on the windows of the print houses, I elbowed my way towards my destination. Or was it my destination at all? Standing under the wooden rooster, which had probably hung there since Shakespeare's day, to catch my breath before entering, I saw that the red lettering painted over the open door read simply and mysteriously, Pertolotes. Most peculiar. I went in to see what was what. Proceeding cautiously, I cast my glance anxiously about me. But neither of my brothers pounced from the shadows to seize me. Indeed, the shop seemed empty. Racks of sheet music flanked the doorway. Some used books had collected in a corner, and the bins and counters displayed an interesting variety of wares. Items for parlour amusements, I decided, as I scanned them. Cards of various sorts, though not, I am glad to say, of the tawdry sort I had been offered on the street. Sets of dominoes, pegboard games, brightly coloured pick-up kits, sticks, little play scripts, stereopticons with story photographs, a terribly clever miniature printing kit with movable type and an inked pad. I was thoughtfully examining this last item when a contralto voice asked, "May I help you?" Looking up, I found myself facing a smiling woman of middle age, who wore, along with her, a simple blouse and a skirt, a comfortable yet unmistakable proprietary air. This was her shop. Even so, it took a moment for my rather overstrained mind to remember that Pertolote was the name of the practically minded hen in Chaucer's Chanticleer story. No wonder Sherlock Holmes had stopped coming here. Somehow ownership had passed from rooster to hen, so to speak, and as our old butler's wife had once told me, neither of my brothers ever could abide a strong-minded woman. Mrs. Bertolotti? I inquired. Her smile warmed and widened as if at a private joke. Bertolotti, she said, correcting my pronunciation so cordially that I felt as though I had been complimented for my attempt. A large-boned woman with a face like a platter and not a pretty one either. She wore her greying hair combed flat, then wound into 2 buns, one over each meaty, pendulous earlobe. What became of Chanticleer? I answered her smile, willing to share her amusement. Oh, Emmett is better. Yet you kept the carved rooster sign? Well, it's very old, and one must take care of old things, mustn't one? Her smile broadened, yet I felt the topic dismissed. How might I be of assistance? Even though she dropped her H's, her accent was not entirely Cockney, but pleasantly semi-cultured. I tried to keep mine such the same as we conversed, indicating the miniature portable printing kit. I asked, could one make calling cards with this? She did not blink, did not seem to wonder why such a poorly clad woman would want any calling cards, much less wish to print her own. She did not hesitate at all before answering. Yes, indeed, but of a rather crude sort. I could make better ones for you, in the back room if you must just need a few. Indeed, I nodded. Thank you. Might I look around your shop? Certainly. There were, in fact, many fascinating trifles and oddities for me to pursue. Square wooden puzzles of tiles that could not be lifted out but slid within the frame, talking boards with numbers and letters for spiritualist experiments, velvet roses, music boxes, feather fans, silk scarves, vizard masks, some quite excellent quality of wigs of long hair most likely shorn from fever victims, or perhaps female convicts. But I took the time mainly because I needed to think. I wanted to accept Bertolotti's offer to make me a few calling cards. I foresaw needing at least one quite soon. But in order to have her print them, I must settle on an alias for myself. Regarding which, my musings resumed where they had left off. Ever me? Ever me? No. Ever I? Every? Even worse. Ever so. Ever so. Given a French twist? Ever so? Not bad. Very well, perhaps I would not have liked to use it for long. But what of a first name? Violet? No, a flower name too risky. Viola. More evocative of a music instrument than of a flower. Viola would do. If the shop owner were greedy, I ruminated, she would have sold me the miniature printing press for far more money than she could have made herself printing a few cards for me on. Apparently a better press she owned. Hence I found myself inclined to trust her, even though Bertolotti was almost certainly not a real name. No matter, she was not to know my real name either. In addition to the calling cards, might I safely buy some even more compromising items from her? I found myself inclined to think so. But what if I were mistaken about her? What if she were the sort to talk? It hardly mattered, for neither Mycroft nor Sherlock were likely ever to speak with her. Either one of them would shudder to go near such a woman plainly in possession of herself, her own business and her own affairs. Neither of my brothers could accept or understand a woman unattached to some man as wife, daughter, or sister. Both of them dismissed women as beyond the comprehension of logical thought. Neither of them could imaginatively enter the mind of any woman, much less mine. When I, a big-nosed beanpole of a girl, had run away, I am sure they had quite expected to find me disguised as a boy. To their way of thinking, how else would such an unfortunately plain female possibly manage? But now they knew that I had masqueraded as a widow, and later as a nun, so probably they were on the lookout for another variation on the ugly as a crow theme, a sharp-faced veiled spinster, perhaps, or a scowling platform woman attempting to reform the slums. Perhaps they had stopped looking for me in male disguise. So, now it was time for me to adopt trousers? No, I simply did not want to. But more important, I had decided that in order to find out the details concerning the disappearance of Dr. Watson, I would call upon Mrs. Watson, and in order to do that, I needed to be a woman. But not such a woman as my brothers would ever suspect or ever dream I could be. Indeed, although I knew the undertaking would involve a tremendous amount of work, I would disguise myself in the last way that either Sherlock or Mycroft could possibly ever envision. I would be beautiful. Chapter 4. I would be beautiful. This was, I admit, a decision prompted partly by spleen, bitterness of spirit, caused by my mother, but deflected onto the more acceptable target of men. I had too often observed how men treated women, plain versus pretty. I planned to embark upon a kind of angry experiment. I would prove that these mighty males could be fooled. But this was also a practical decision, for I was walking into a trap. I could not yet dismiss the possibility that my brother and Watson had concocted an elaborate scheme to take me in. If it were so, why I must walk out again unrecognized. Even if the crisis were genuine, as I was more inclined to believe, then Mrs. Watson was sure to be in close touch with Sherlock Holmes, and if she were to mention to him that a tall, thin, ill-favoured girl with a pronounced nose and chin had come calling, he would certainly suspect it was me, and he would be on my trail like a bloodhound. If, however, Mrs. Watson were to mention a visitor of unusual comeliness, he would pay no attention whatsoever. There was only one drawback to being beautiful. I wanted Mrs. Watson to confide in me. But women, even those who are themselves pretty, often dislike an attractive woman, and while unacquainted with Mrs. Watson personally, I knew she herself was unexceptionally in appearance, having read in Dr. Watson's excellent account of the Sign of the Four, how he had met Mary Morstan, as she was then called, when she had consulted Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Watson had described his wife to be as having neither regularity of feature nor beauty of complexion, but went on to say that her expression was sweet and amiable, and her large blue eyes were singularly spiritual and sympathetic. Perhaps being good-natured, she would not, after all, resent me. Also from the Sign of the Four, I had learned that Mrs. Watson possessed no relatives in England, hence her visit to Holmes when she had found herself in perplexity. Her mother and father were dead. After boarding school she had been a governess, not exactly a servant, but hardly on an equal standing with her employers either. Most governesses dined alone, and alone I suspected was how she might find herself even now, for as a physician's wife she remained in a position halfway between working class and gentry. If she had led a retired life, having no circle of friends before her marriage, was she likely to have one since? I judged her not. Poor folk who were in trouble ran straight to Mary. According to Dr. Watson, doubtless she shared his kindness of heart. But in her own time of trouble, would those same poor folk comfort her? I doubted it. Some people wish to be alone in times of trial, but others craved company. While I had no way of knowing, I must take a chance that Mrs. Watson might be one of the latter, and might very much welcome the diversion of a visitor, even a stranger at this difficult time. I hoped so. Indeed, I hoped she would tell me something, however trivial, that might help me enlighten the mystery of her missing husband. A truly lovely creature descended from a cab in front of Dr. Watson's office residence the next afternoon, lovely with an innocent, modest, timeless beauty so artless that she wafted up the scrubbed white steps like a breath of fresh woodland air. Artless? Hardly. Hours and hours of work had gone into the preparation of Miss Viola Eversor, and I could never have achieved such artlessness if it were not for the blood of artists running in my veins. Natural beauty is more a matter of illusion. You see, an arrangement of proportions to foster a conspiracy of admiration amongst the senses of the beholder. My brother Sherlock had once mentioned something of the sort. Mycroft, he had said to my older brother, the girl's head, you'll observe, is quite small in proportion to her remarkably tall body. He had been negatively assessing my intelligence at the time, and his conclusion was mistaken, but his statement itself was quite true. Therefore I had purchased at Bertolotti's a wig of exceptional luxuriance. Arrangement of proportions, in the case of feminine portraiture, means, first and foremost, arrangement of hair. And my own hair, even if it were not the color of mud and the consistency of a marsh, is annoyingly located atop my head, where I cannot possibly see it, or reach it properly to address it. But the wig! What a difference! I simply set it upon a candlestick in front of me, then arrange its shining rosewood-hued tresses until I get them exactly the way I wanted them. Ringlets and a careless chignon at the crown, leaving a generous fringe around the forward edges. Without the wig and without the inserts I used to round out my cheeks and nostrils, I was a sharp-faced, hawk-nosed, sallow-skinned female version of my brother Sherlock. But lovely and convincingly natural-looking hair so amended the proportions of my head that my pronounced nose and chin miraculously transformed into a classic Grecian profile. Framed by a russet fringe and tresses, my skin looked not pallid, but delicately porcelain. Even I could scarcely believe the transformation. There was more, much more to be done, of course. Natural beauty requires a flaw. A certain wanton violation of symmetry, so I glued a small raised port wine birthmark, courtesy of Bertolotti's, at my right temple, where it served to draw attention away from the center of my face. That is to say, my proboscis. When I dusted my face with the rice powder as if it were attempting to hide the slight blemish, the rice powder was permissible for a lady to use, but the next item I took in hand, rogue, was not. I had to apply the disreputable substance very subtly to my cheekbones and lips. Then I had Spanish papers with which to rub my eyelids, making my eyes appear large and lustrous, but not so much that the artifice could be detected. It took me many attempts to get them right. As I have said, becoming beautiful required hours and hours of labor. With, might I add, no guarantee at all that Mrs. Watson would receive me. It was quite possible that, under the circumstances, she had taken to her bed in nervous prostration, unable to entertain visitors, even if she were willing. Stars and garters! What if I were turned away from her door after all this work? But one could try. And at last I was ready. Taking a final look in the mirror, I must say I felt an unexpectedly fierce sensation of triumph. Mrs. Tupper, unfortunately, happening to see me going out, dropped the china pitcher she was carrying. It smashed to bits. On that percussive note, I took my cab to the Watson address, and if I wafted up the steps like a woodland breeze, it was because my sylvan paradise, Eau de Toilette, also purchased the day before. I had never in my life bothered with fragrance. Let the gutters stink all they liked. I was never one to hold a scented handkerchief to my nose. But beauty, as I have said, lies not only in the eyes of the beholder, but in a carefully orchestrated conspiracy of all the senses. Hence, perfume. And I had swallowed honey to sweeten my voice. Cosseting myself, I had made doubly sure that my must enhancer remained free of lumps from any of the various objects I stored therein. Also, I had chosen my dress, as you might imagine, with great care to appear neither humble nor aristocratic. Every artless thing about me, from my gypsy bonnet, a small flat hat with a few howls, to my polished button-top boots, was the result of hours of trial and deliberation. Indeed, I had been up half the night preparing for this encounter. I could only hope that my sleeplessness gave soulful depth to the expression in my eyes. At that moment I reached my destination, of course, doubt swept in. What if I were a fool? What if the whole world could see that I was merely a cow, a crow masquerading as a peacock? Just at that moment, naturally, the door opens, but the bouquet I carried, snowdrops and jasmine, hope and sympathy, carefully arranged and bound by a yellow ribbon, explained my presence. There was no need for me to speak. I hoped that the parlour-maid did not notice how my gloved hands trembled as I laid my calling card, Miss Viola Everso, on a silver tray. Chapter 5. The maid showed me into a very modest parlour, then whisked away towards the back of the house to find a mistress. I stood looking around me. Each parlour window had been raised exactly 2 inches. Fortunately, in this part of London, the spring air stank only of smoke and street muck, odours mostly offset by the fragrance of the flowers I carried. In London, I had come to realize those with any spare income at all considered flowers not a luxury, but a necessity for their homes and persons, in order to make living bearable to the sense of smell. From the back of the house I heard a soft voice ask, "Who is it, Rose?" And then, without waiting for an answer, with my card still in her hand, Mrs. Watson entered the parlour, her face very pale, yet composed. With quiet but warm concern, she asked, "Have you come to see the doctor? I'm afraid he's not in. Is there anything I can do for you?" I stood, astonished, for I could see how red and swollen her eyes were. No longer could I doubt in the slightest that Dr. Watson indeed had disappeared, for Mrs. Watson's distress was genuine and evident. Yet she expected to render service, not to receive sympathy. This amazing woman shamed me so much that, handing her the simple bouquet I had brought with me, I could barely speak coherently. "I read about it in the news," I babbled. I cannot imagine why. He's so very kind. Your husband, I mean. I do hope he's all right. I beg your pardon for intruding at such a difficult time, but I thought perhaps some flowers." Other bouquets had arrived, I saw, but not so many as the crown in the small parlour. "How very thoughtful of you. Thank you." Mrs. Watson's lip trembled as she accepted the snowdrops and jasmine from me, but a gaze settled upon my face, remained inquiring. "I have been a patient of your husband's," I added hastily in reply to her unspoken request that I should please explain myself, as I should have done in the beginning. She nodded, humbly accepting the presence of a very young, rather bird-brained, and quite attractive, I hoped, stranger in her parlour. "You'll forgive me, I'm sure. I do not know of his patients." "You can hardly be expected to. And when I saw in the paper, I had to do something. For he was not only remedied my difficulty, but showed the greatness and tact and sympathy in doing so." This was true, in a way. When lying, I always make every possible use of the truth. I can carry it off better that way and remember more easily what I have said. "But how thoughtful of you. What a loving gesture. Your being here." Feeling painfully like a fraud, I mentally reminded myself quite sternly that I was here to help her. "What lovely flowers," she continued, cradling them in one arm as if holding a baby. "Miss Eversor, I'd be most obliged. I mean, if it is no inconvenience. Would you care to stay a while and have some tea?" It was as I had thought it might be. No matter what her natural reserve, at this time of trouble Mrs. Watson needed someone, any safe and sympathetic listener to talk to. As soon as we were seated, with only the slightest encouragement from me, she began to tell me how her husband had left the house, in excellent humour this past Wednesday morning, planning to make some house calls and perhaps stop at his club. But in the evening he had not returned. "I kept his supper warm till it turned to cinder," she said in a sort of bewilderment, "and still I could not bring myself to throw it in the dustbin, because to do so would have been to acknowledge that he was terribly overdue, and I could not yet admit that something had happened. I kept telling myself, he would be home any minute. He had to be." She had waited all night for him, and in the morning she had sent for the police, and of course for Sherlock Holmes. She assumed correctly that I understood her husband's association with the famous detective. The police had arrived first, but refused to take action until they saw evidence of a crime. They said, "Wait a bit. It's not uncommon for a man to disappear for a day or 2 or 3, and then come home all sheep-faced, having spent the time drunk in an opium den with some loose women." "Did they actually say that?" I exclaimed. "Not in so many words, but one could tell well enough what they meant. As if John would ever do such things." Even in the heat of righteous indignation, Mrs. Watson's tone remained sweet. Luckily, Sherlock Holmes came soon after, and set about finding out what had happened. And has he done so? He said I would not hear from him until he had something to report. And I have not. Has he no theory? He wonders whether some villain is attempting revenge against him, of course. John himself has no enemies. No disagreeable patients. Well, of course there is always that. Mr. Holmes took John's medical record books to check. Good. Then she herself was unlikely to look up Viola ever so in them. I leaned towards her. Mrs. Watson, what do you think has happened? For a moment, her composure faltered. She had to lift her hands to her face. I truly cannot imagine. Just then the maid brought in the tea tray. Making a visible effort, Mrs. Watson rallied and then, as she poured, changed the subject. Do you live with your family here in London, Miss, ever so? I told her that, no, I lived alone. I'd worked in an office, was without employment just now and hoped to find a position in Fleet Street. All true. Not that it mattered. If I had told her I rode bareback in a circus, she would have nodded just the same, for her distress was such that she could comprehend nothing. We sipped tea in awkward silence. For something to say, I complimented the room in which we sat. Such lovely lithographs. I quite approve of the combination of comfortable furnishings with touches of culture. I quite approved of Mrs. Watson herself, actually, so bravely serving a second cup of tea while she looked around her own parlour as if she had never been there before. I added, what a lovely little spinet. Having been a governess, of course, she had spent half her life at the keyboard of a piano. But I asked anyway, do you play? She scarcely heard the question. Of course, poor thing. Yes, I... Her sorely preoccupied thoughts wandered apparently to a posy of daisies placed upon the instrument. So many flowers do serve to console one, she remarked vaguely. Somewhat, at least, and from strangers yet. People are so kind. Nodding agreement, I privately thought she was rejoicing over crumbs, for there were not many flowers at all. There was, of course, the bouquet I had brought, which I was glad to see the maid had placed in a vase exactly as I had arranged it. There was a little nosegay of lily of the valley, wishing Mrs. Watson the return of happiness. There was the ubiquitous carnations and white roses, and I tucked away in this corner table the most bizarre bouquet I had ever set my eyes on. I'm sure I sat up straighter, and my eyes widened, but I kept myself from saying anything more than a murmured, How peculiar. What? Slowly, Mrs. Watson turned to see what had caught my attention. Oh, yes, odd, isn't it? The poppies should be red, but they're white, and the maize should be white, but it's red, and I've no idea what the greens are. Asparagus, I marvelled. Not the vegetable, of course, but the cow-baby fronds that sprung up afterwards with leaves like Pa's grey-green hair. Once it's grown, you know. Which it should not be at this time of year. Only the spears should be sprouting from the ground. Mrs. Watson blinked. My goodness, how clever you are! How did you learn that? My mother was a botanist. True enough, and it might have been said of the half-genteel ladies in England, flowers and botany were considered to be a female hobby. And she studied asparagus? I've never seen it placed in a bouquet before. Neither have I. But if the greens were bizarre, the blossoms were worse. The significance chilled me. Taking care not to reveal this in the tone of my voice, I asked, Mrs. Watson, are you familiar with what is sometimes called the language of flowers? Only a little. There has been small occasion for such communication in my life. She said this with gentle good humour. The may signifies hope, does it not, and the poppy, comfort? In the French tradition, yes. But this was England, and in British folklore, hawthorn, what she called May, was a shrub long associated with pagan deities and with fairies, a powerful symbol of bad luck. No countrywoman would ever bring a sprig of its pretty cluster blossoms indoors, for to do so might call upon some calamity upon the house, even death. I did not say this, but I did say, the red poppy implies comfort, I believe, but the white poppy symbolizes sleep. Really? She thought about that for a moment, then actually smiled. Well, I certainly could use some sleep. But a very odd bouquet. Who, might I ask, gave it to you? Why, I don't know. I believe a boy brought it to the door. Setting my cup of tea aside, I stood crossing the room to get a better look. The poppies must have been forced into a hothouse. All flowers except snowdrops came from hothouses at this time of year. Nothing remarkable in that. But that the asparagus should have been so cultivated. Most peculiar. Explicable, perhaps, if someone had a boundless yearning for the vegetable. But the hawthorn? Who on earth would trouble with such a useless prickle bush as hawthorn in a hothouse, when like a weed it grew everywhere in the countryside? Upon studying the hawthorn more closely, I saw that its jagged branches were wound round with tendrils of a delicate vine, whose white flowers had already wilted. Bindweed. A sort of wild trumpet flower, bindweed would be as common as sparrows in country hedgerows come summertime, but like the hawthorn this early in the year, it must have been forced indoors. More, it must have been cultivated with the hawthorn, to entwine it so. Bindweed, more correctly known as convolvulus. The plant indicated something convoluted, something stealthy, entangled, twisted. And this ominous bouquet, it seemed to me, had come from quite a twisted mind. I had to find out. But as I turned to question Mrs. Watson in more detail, the parlour door burst open without waiting for the maid to announce him. A tall, impeccably clad, yet vehement gentleman strode in, almost swooped in his manner as hawk-like as the keen profile of his face. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 6. I regret to say that I gasped aloud, both in terror and in admiration. Those two emotions seemed always to attend my dealings with my renowned brother. To me, his craggy features were the most handsome in England, his grey eyes the most brilliant, and if circumstances were different. But there was no time for pointless dreams. I fully comprehended all the peril of my situation, and I admit that I felt a strong inclination to flee. Luckily, in contemplation of the bizarre bouquet, I stood so near the wall that it checked my impulse to back away. Had I made such an ill-considered move, I'm sure my brother might have noticed. But he barely glanced at me, although it took me several thudding heartbeats to comprehend why. For there I stood in plain sight, his tall, gawky, long-nosed sister Enola. Until I realized that my disguise had kept him from really looking at me. Indeed, the moment he saw a winsome, coiffed and attired young woman in the parlour along with Mrs. Watson, he turned his attention elsewhere. One might think he disliked to be in the company with such a woman. And if I gasped aloud, he did not hear it, for at the same time Mrs. Watson jumped with a cry. "Mr. Holmes!" She stretched out both her hands towards him. Is there any news of John?" To judge by his taut and sombre face, not any good news. As if capturing two fluttering doves, he took Mrs. Watson's hands in his kid-gloved grasp, but he did not speak, only making a shushing motion with his lips, and threw a warning glance in my direction. "Oh, how thoughtless of me!" Hardly what he meant to convey. He wanted her to get rid of me, but she seemed to feel that she had been rude, forgetting to introduce me. Freeing her hands, she turned to me. "Miss, If one is literally trembling with ill-mixed emotion, one might as well make the best use of it. Relieving Mrs. Watson of the necessity of remembering my name, I squealed, "Is this really Mr. Holmes, the great detective? Simulating great girlish excitement, I hurried forward, smiling, nay, grinning with like a skull. "Oh, I am so thrilled!" I squeaked, my voice a full octave above its usual level. Even as I quaked in fear that my brother might recognize me, I grasped one of his gloved hands in both of mine. "Oh, just wait until I tell my aunt that I met the famous Mr. Sherlock Holmes." My effusions had the effect I desired. If a sewer rat had crawled upon Sherlock, it might have repulsed him less. He could not bear to look me in the face, turning his head away as he said frostily, "Miss, Everso, Miss Viola Everso," I blurbed. "Miss Everso, will you kindly excuse us?" "Of course, absolutely. I know you and Mrs. Watson, that is, you have important matters to discuss. I'm frightfully honored and delighted to have met you." Twittering in inanities, I allowed myself to be ushered away by the faithful parlour-maid Rose, who had appeared for that purpose with my wrap in her hands. Even after I heard the front door of the Watson residence close behind me, I could not quite really believe my escape. Mincing down the stone steps, I expected at any moment to hear Sherlock shout, "Wait a moment! Enola! Enola! Constable, stop that girl in the wig!" But instead I heard his voice, speaking to Mrs. Watson. "There is no good news, I'm afraid." The words, although quietly and gravely spoken, carried clearly to me through the partially open parlour windows. "But I have found something. I have found Watson's medical bag." I stopped on the pavement where I stood. Oh my goodness! I couldn't simply leave. The sound of my brother's voice acted upon me like a magnet upon needles and pins. I had to know more. But what if I were caught listening? Pretending to search my pockets for something, I glanced up and down the street, which lay quiet except for a milkmaid making her deliveries, and a cab or two. London is odd that way. Slum streets sprawl, always with women standing in open doorways, shouting at one another, children running amok in the muck, beggars, vendors, drunkards, idlers. But the better residential streets lie almost empty. Their scrubbed doorsteps led up to closed doors, flanked by windows without a single broken pane of glass. Instead, one sees potted geraniums, a canary in a hanging cage, a meek little room-to-let sign and lace curtains. But one cannot tell whether one is being watched from behind the lace curtains. Holmes spoke on. "I found it at his club, where someone had stowed it out of sight behind a davenport. It remained unnoticed until today." But John would not have left." Mrs. Watson's quiet voice struggled against tears. "Exactly." My brother's voice also suppressed strong emotion. My heart swelled when I heard such controlled anguish in his words. "No doctor, least of all Watson, would ever be willing to be separated from his black bag." Wary of my own feelings, I realized I was quite likely to betray myself with a whimper or some equally undignified involuntary utterance. "Enola, you silly chit!" I mentally scolded myself. "Get away!" I moved, however, only a few steps, just enough so that Holmes and Mrs. Watson would not see me if either of them happened to glance outside. I put myself on a line with the corner of the house and of the parlour. There I stood fiddling with my gloves while I tried to calm my breathing and the pounding of my heart. I could still hear my brother speaking. "Therefore, I think we can rule out the possibility of accident. Watson was purposely lured or spirited away by some personal agency unknown." Mrs. Watson's soft reply was inaudible to me. "I cannot be certain, but it seems to me that the anti-medical elements, yammering as if surgery were vivisection, tend towards hysteria, and are unlikely to act with such organized decision. Yet although improbable, it remains just possible, as do other hypotheses. Some enemy from Watson's army days, perhaps. I've been looking into that possibility, but my instincts tell me otherwise. Above all, I continue to suspect the criminal underworld, but my informants so far have been able to tell me nothing. It is as if one moment Watson were playing billiards in his club, and the next The earth opens up. With a tattoo of hooves on cobbles, a delivery van rattled past, the driver glancing at me curiously, probably wondering why I was standing there. In London, any unchaperoned woman who pauses even for a moment to blow her nose puts herself in danger of being taken for a social evil, the polite term for a lady of the night. It is this silence, this hiatus, that I cannot understand, Sherlock was saying when the noise had passed. If Watson was kidnapped, why not demand for ransom? If taken by some enemy, why not gloating message of revenge? We should have heard from such a tormentor by now. Have you anything to report? Anything out of the ordinary? Her reply was brief. Flowers? Said Holmes with a dismissive impatience. But surely such social gestures are to be expected. No. If we are to involve the police, we need something more than a black bag and an anonymous bouquet. Please think. Is there nothing? Mrs. Watson said something in broken tones. It is true, logic suggests no reason why murder might not have taken place. My brother's voice had tightened to the breaking point. And, in that case, there would be no communication. Yes, I have thought it too. Yet I cannot give up hope. One must not give up hope. And, he added with a black fire flaring in his tone, I will not rest until I've got to the bottom of this affair. A considerable silence followed, during which another vehicle trundled past. This time a brougham, the driver and occupants eyeing me askance. I felt like a target set up for marksmanship practice. Finally, my brother spoke again. We must persevere. We cannot do otherwise. Can you think of nothing to help me? Silence. Have you had visitors? Other than that syrupy young woman who left just now? Who was she, by the way? Oh my goodness. My nerves could not take no more. I left, walking down the street in the manner recommended by a lady's moral companion. Self-possessed and quietly, with not too much lagging and not too swift a step, looking as if one understood what one is about. Only after I had rounded a corner did I let my breath out. I wondered whether I had now been added to Sherlock's list of suspects. I certainly hoped not. I did not want him to be interested in the syrupy young woman, all the more so because he must not waste his time while trying to find out what had happened to Watson. But he was wasting his time, I realized, as I entered a crowded thoroughfare of shops and businesses. Avoid lounging against the shop windows, resolute, forego even the most tempting displays of finery, past men without looking at them, yet all the while seeing them. Brilliant as my brother was at unravelling many sorts of perplexities, he continued to err by neglecting the woman's sphere, in this case, the messages conveyed by the flowers. It seemed to me that a gloating message of revenge had indeed arrived in the form of hawthorn, poppies, convolvulus, and the oddest of greens. Asparagus. The asparagus I did not at all understand. Nevertheless, I felt fairly sure that the bizarre bouquet had not come from the criminal underworld, nor from anyone Watson had known in the army. No, I thought it had come from someone who would not last long in either of those organizations. Someone too odd for them. Someone eccentric, petty, and spiteful in quite a creative way. Someone enjoying an interesting garden variety of gleeful madness. And someone so dedicated to the pursuit of botanical malice that he, or she, grew hawthorn in a hothouse.